Good afternoon, everybody in Seoul. My name is Michael Brear from the University of Melbourne. I'm very sorry not to be able to join you in person at the moment. I have some family commitments right now that I can't avoid. But I wish you all good health, and I hope you're enjoying having a real conference with real colleagues and friends face to face. Today, I'd like to talk to you about some results from a project that we have been running in Australia for the last year and a half. It's a project by the University of Melbourne, the University of Queensland, Princeton University, and a consultancy called the Nous Group in Australia. And it's a project called Net Zero Australia. This is obviously very topical for Australia, but I do note, of course, the very close ties between Korea and Australia in many things, but particularly our energy sectors. And so I hope some of what I present today is very relevant to your own discussions. Now, a little bit of background on the study. The Net Zero Australia project is analysing net zero pathways that reflect what we call the boundaries of the Australian debate, for both our domestic and, importantly for the audience here today, our export emissions. As you all know, Korea, Japan, and other countries are very important export partners for the Australian energy sector. We want this study to be rigorous and granular, scenario-based and evidence-driven, technology neutral and non-political. Just like in Korea, in Australia, the net zero discussion can get very political. Some people rule out certain technologies for very good reasons. Some people rule out certain technologies for less good reasons, and we're trying to avoid that kind of thinking by being very open and studying in a broad way how different futures might evolve. Our project is established by some very generous support by Australian industry, particularly APA and Dow Australia, Worley and the Minderoo Foundation. The Minderoo Foundation being, of course, the charitable foundation of Mr. Andrew Forrest, who many of you will know, as well as two research organisations that bring together government, universities and industry, the Future Energy Exports CRC and the Future Fuels CRC, where CRC means Cooperative Research Centres. And we're certainly very, very grateful for the financial support of all of our sponsors. But we also note that their support is formulated as either gifts or grant agreements from the two CRCs that protect the project's independence. So our sponsors do not dictate to the project steering committee how the project will evolve. Rather, we have an advisory group who advise us, and that advisory group is deliberately designed to have a very wide sector representation from relevant organisations in the Australian energy debate. So we have non-government organisations, we have union representatives, we have representatives of farmers, of native title holders, of different groups in Australian society that, for example, have different levels of access to energy. We also have independent members. These are people who have a distinguished career in the sector, and also our sponsors are nominees on our advisory group. And finally, this study has been engaging very broadly with the Australian community, with our Commonwealth and state governments, non-government organisations, research bodies and industries. And I encourage you to go to that website, netzeroaustralia.net.au, for further information. There's the team who has been working on this project for the last year and a half and continue to work very hard on this project. And as you can see, this is a large effort. Now, today I would like to talk to you about 6 scenarios that we look at as part of this net zero debate. we of course have a reference scenario, which is essentially the do-nothing scenario, what we might call the frozen policy setting scenario. So we ignore the greenhouse gas mitigation challenge. For the 5 other scenarios that we study, they are all either on the demand side, feature a rapid electrification of the Australian energy sector or a slower electrification of the Australian energy sector. So in our rapid electrification, for example, every car on Australian roads is fully electric by mid-century, whereas on our slower electrification scenario, there's a delayed uptake of electric vehicles. All other end-use appliances, be they heaters, be that heavy-duty or medium-duty vehicles or industrial uses, will have consistent approaches to this evolution of the demand side. Now, on the supply side, we consider 3 possibilities. One is where we have full renewable rollout. Now, we all know that achieving fully renewable systems is technically very challenging, but in this study, we're not making a comment on whether or not such a system is or is not achievable. We're taking it as a given that it is achievable for this particular scenario. And you will see later on what that means in terms of the scale of renewable build for Australia. Such a system does not permit fossil fuel use for generation and does not permit carbon capture and storage on any process that uses fossil fuels directly. We have a constrained renewable rollout similarly, which must involve much higher use of carbon capture and storage if we are to avoid unserved energy, and which constrains renewable rollout, but still at a rate of deployment that is several times historical best achievement. And then finally, as you know, that Australia is a very large commodity export other than energy. We look at a scenario where rather than, for example, exporting a hydrogen carrier, we look at less export of iron ore and more export of iron, where that hydrogen carrier is used domestically instead of exported in an onshoring scenario. So this approach uses a linear model emissions reduction for most domestic and export systems. We use the best available inputs and assumptions. We provide a typical generation expansion plan, a least cost optimization, and then we also map what potential futures would look like with what we call a downscaling approach to look at the evolution of the Australian landscape as we decarbonise. But we deliberately look in this study at scenarios that are very broad by the rate of electrification, broad by renewable build rates and limits on fossil fuel use, and broad by the uptake of carbon capture and storage. In doing so, we're not saying any one of these scenarios is better or worse than the others. So what does this study do? It illustrates pathways to help people appreciate scale, complexity, and cost. And when you see the results, you will appreciate how big the energy system needs to become. It also, importantly, does not make predictions or recommendations. We're not telling anybody what they should do. We're suggesting to people, this is what the world looks like if you wanted these inputs. So the key insights we make from this study are as follows. Overall, net zero is both an immense challenge and a once-in-a-generation, globally significant and nation-building opportunity for Australia. Number one, renewables will produce most or all domestic energy by mid-century. The more productive use of energy can keep domestic demand to about the same, despite significant population growth, about 50% population growth we assume over the next 30 years. Carbon capture and storage can play an important role, complementing renewables. Note that that is not must play. It is a statement that it can play, complementing renewables. 4, unprecedented capital investment is needed, and this should produce significant benefits. 5, domestic energy share of GDP need not rise above today's level, whilst it will become less prone to price shocks, as we're currently all experiencing. Clean energy can replace our fossil fuel exports. The cost to export clean energy may rise, but should be competitive in a decarbonising global economy, because Australia is a country with a very large renewable resource base and close to important markets like Korea. A large workforce with new skills will be required, particularly in Northern Australia, where our strong renewable resources are. Importantly, the emissions from farms, forestry and waste are significant, but will fall, but are unlikely to reach net zero. And that's important because that means that carbon capture and storage will be required in such a future in order to achieve net zero. And finally, large changes in land and sea use will occur, and that needs careful planning and community engagement. So here's an example of the kinds of futures that we see in this net zero world across these 6 scenarios. The leftmost scenario for the domestic Australian system shows that we remain roughly a 6 exajoule economy overall. For all of the net zero scenarios, you see our primary energy use falls for at least some of the pathway. That's because, of course, there's significant energy productivity benefits, but we're also seeing, for all of these scenarios, very large changes in the use of coal and the use of renewables. And depending on the scenario we use, we get different rates of growth of different types of renewables, be that utility scale solar, onshore wind or offshore wind in particular. But in some of these scenarios, you see fossil fuels do continue to be used throughout the transition because, as we will see later on, there are other means of sequestering the emissions associated with that. Now, in terms of installed capacity for our domestic system, so this is just the generation that serves Australian domestic loads, not the energy that gets sent offshore. We see we rise from a system with about 25 gigawatts of renewables in it today to a system in all net zero cases with roughly 400 gigawatts by mid-century. At the same time, the growth of firm capacity is significant over these periods, growing from about 50 gigawatts today to 100 to 150 gigawatts, where most of that growth is in batteries, but also we're seeing the replacement of coal-fired generation with gas-fired generation and pumped hydro. The gas-fired generation transitions from natural gas in 2020 to being fully hydrogen-fueled by mid-century. So combined cycle gas and OCGT gas peakers are hydrogen-fueled by mid-century rather than gas-fueled. But still we see comparable amounts of thermal generation over the next 30 years as battery use grows enormously. Now, in terms of our energy use, this shows us how there are very large benefits with our projected final energy demand. With the population growth of about 50%, we get about a 30 to 40% growth in primary energy in the reference case, but we maintain energy demand at roughly constant levels with these increasingly aggressive energy productivity efforts. And these efforts are much more intense than has been achieved in Australia historically. Similarly, we see very large growth in the use of carbon capture and storage from nothing today. Depending on the scenario, we cap it for several of our scenarios at 150 million tonnes per year, which is an assessment of what we think is that was given to us by the owners and operators of existing prospective CCS fields in Australia. And then we also do a scenario, the RE minus scenario, where we show that when we constrain renewables to be only several times historical best rates of deployment, we need to have much larger growth of CCS use in order to avoid unserved energy. And that's a very, very large amount of geological CO2 sequestration in that case. What I would point out, though, perhaps of most interest, is even the fully renewable system, that is that green dashed line at the bottom, features about 80 megatons of CO2 injection in 2045. And that is the scenario where the energy system is fully renewable in its generation. And that CCS is used to offset sectors such as aviation, cement making, steel making, and some agricultural emissions. So even in fully renewable energy systems, we see a need for CCS. Now, in terms of cost, we're seeing these costs. These are the black line are pre-COVID-like costs, and certainly pre-Ukraine war-like costs. And the Australian energy system costs using those kinds of inputs are about $100 billion per year that at the moment. Now, that cost includes the cost of the end-use appliances, so the cars, the heaters, the cookers in your homes. But as we see, as we go across to various net zero domestic futures, those total domestic energy system costs rise significantly to about 75% more than current pre-COVID-like numbers. Most of that rise, though, is because the population growth is significant. So when we normalise those costs by the growth of Australian gross domestic product, we see that these total system costs stay about the same as what the energy system was costing us per annum pre-COVID, around about 5% of GDP. When we look at the export sector, we can see these very large numbers for Australian energy exports. So the reference scenario shows that in 2020, we're exporting about 15 exajoules of energy. Now, I showed earlier that Australia's domestic system is about a 5 or 6 exajoule system. So Australia exports a lot more energy than it consumes, and a lot of that energy goes to yourselves in Korea. As we decarbonise, we can see that those coal and then those LNG exports are displaced by a hydrogen carrier and also undersea export via electricity cable. Interestingly, in the onshoring scenario, we, rather than sending a hydrogen carrier off to our big export partners, we see a switching of sending iron rather than currently iron ore, and aluminium rather than alumina and bauxite to our export partners. So there is opportunity for very substantial switching between energy exports that are increasingly clean and other commodity exports that are increasingly clean. Finally, the costs of achieving this kind of transition grow as we become cleaner. So we're seeing that typical energy prices, as we tend toward net zero by mid-century, approach $30 to $40 a gigajoule. That's in Australian currency. But of course, these costs are now very similar to the kinds of costs that we are seeing in a post-Ukraine war world. So these costs, whilst very high, are no longer unprecedented. In terms of employment, we're seeing very large growth of sectoral employment domestically, a factor of 3 or 4 growth in the number of engineers and technicians and many other types of people working in the sector, but also a very large growth in the export sector servicing the build of these very large assets that enable clean energy export. And you'll be able to see in a minute why that's the case. I won't talk about the agricultural emissions other than say that we do not project them to become negative by mid-century. Here is a map, though, of what one potential future of Australia would look like in terms of this net zero world. And you can see here these very large zones across the north of the country, which are very, very large solar and wind zones that produce green hydrogen for energy export, coupled with a very substantial augmentation of our transmission network and renewable generation and other assets all around the country. There's a massive amount of investment in this build. And to give you further example of that build, I'll show you some examples of the kinds of maps as we track towards net zero. So here is a map of Australia in 2020, where those fine lines across the country are our existing transmission network, and you can see some dots which represent wind and solar farms around our major capital cities. We have at the moment 159 operating variable renewable energy projects. When we go to 2030, you start to see very large augmentation of our transmission network and the creation of these energy export hubs across the north of the country in particular, and growth of big renewable assets around our major capital cities. So even by 2030, we've gone from 25 gigawatts of renewables to about 150 gigawatts of renewables. Very rapid, very large growth. In 2040, we're now seeing these very large export hubs well and truly being established, and we have a roughly 900 gigawatts of renewable assets. And then by 2050, you're seeing now these export hubs well established and the country having over 2,000 gigawatts of renewable asset, most of which is serving our export markets, such as Korea. So that kind of deployment is roughly 40 times the capacity of Australia's current national electricity market. So it is a massive undertaking. I'll end my talk there. If you would like more information on the project, please go to that website, and you will find this presentation as well as all of our input assumptions and much more information on the project. And we also encourage you to contact us via that email, but via that website for further information. Thank you very much.